Hi, everyone. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. As you know, this show features a lot of scientists and scholars who sometimes discuss difficult to understand topics in science and math, computer science, physics, cosmology, and even string theory and quantum physics, subjects for which I, as your host, am wholly unqualified to truly understand. So, this is why I love and subscribe to Brilliant.org. This is the online platform that presents short courses crafted by award-winning teachers, researchers, and professionals from MIT, Caltech, Duke, Microsoft, Google, and more. So do me a favor right now, before you listen to today's episode, go to brilliant.org/skeptic and you get a 30-day free trial plus 20% off your annual subscription. What is it exactly you're subscribing to? Well, first of all, you just tap on the app on your phone and you just open it right up. You can do this on your laptop as well. And you can go through the different short courses and little tutorials they have. For example, under the category of college science classes, Brilliant offers short courses in scientific thinking, classical mechanics, electricity and magnetism, quantum objects, quantum computing, chemical reaction, computational biology, and more. So what I love about Brilliant, and why I think you'll love it too, is that these are bite-sized lessons and tutorials. Quick guides presented in a well-paced, game-like process. So you kind of go through it, and it takes you back if you get it wrong, and you just keep going along until you master it. And you can do that in just 15 minutes a day. It's astonishing how much you can learn just 15 minutes a day. So check it out. Go to brilliant.org/skeptic and get your free 30-day trial plus 20% off your annual subscription. Okay, before I introduce today's podcast guest, I want to talk to you about podcasts because I found a new one to listen to. You know, I'm a big fan of consuming content when I'm out and about, and podcasts are the new way to do it. And I have a bunch of favorites, but here's a new one I just found recently called Everything, Everywhere, Daily. This is Gary Arnett's podcast. He himself is one of the more interesting characters I've come across. He, in 2007, sold his house and he started traveling the world. He's visited all 7 continents. He's been in all 204 countries and territories in the world. He's traveled to all 50 U.S. states and every U.S. territory, and in Canada as well. He's been to over 220 U.S. national park sites and photographed over 400 UNESCO sites. The reason I bring this up is because his interests are as varied as his travels, and his podcast, which he posts every day. They're about 15 minutes long or so, give or take a few minutes here. Just an amazing variety of subjects that just never, half of them I never even considered. Like, why isn't the West Indies a single country? I don't know. Here's one on the Galapagos Islands I'm going to listen to today because I've been there 5 times, but I'll bet he has some insights that I've never thought of. He gives a brief history of lesson. By the way, I'm just scrolling down just for the month of July here. Brief history of London, the Silurian hypothesis. Silurian is a geological age. He studied geology in graduate school, by the way. Here's one on titanium. There's another one called The Greatest Concert of All Time. Is that the one I went to with The Who and Dodger Stadium? No. This was on December 22nd, 1808 in Vienna, Austria. Of course, Ludwig von Beethoven. There's one on Emperor Claudius. I mentioned this one before. Could there be extraterrestrial life in our solar system? I really love that one because that's one of those fascinating topics. So check it out. Go to Everything, Everywhere, Daily. This is what the podcast looks like. I just queued it up here on Spotify, but it's on all the podcast platforms that you use. Really, it's just such an interesting podcast. Check it out. They're short little bites, and you learn something new every day. All right, here's my episode. All right, my guest today is Saad, the returning champion of the show. He's one of the best-known public intellectuals fighting the tyranny of political correctness. He's a professor of marketing at the John Molson School of Business at Concordia University, where he also held the research chair in evolutionary behavioral sciences and Darwinian consumption from 2008 to 2018. This is the Darwinian model studying consumption, not Darwinian consumption as in people competing to eat the most. He is a pioneer in the application of evolutionary psychology to consumer behavior, and he's the author, as such, of The Evolutionary Bases of Consumption, The Consuming Instinct, and numerous scientific papers. And he edited the scholarly book Evolutionary Psychology in the Business Sciences. His previous best-selling popular trade book, for which he was on the show before, is The Parasitic Mind, How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense. And his new book, here it is, with his handsome mug on the cover, all right. It's called The Sad Truth, as in his last name, about happiness. 8 Secrets for Living the Good Life. All right, Gad, nice to see you. How are you doing, man?
Oh, so nice to be with you again, Michael. You are looking glowing, which I expect when you live in Santa Barbara. It's good to be with you.
Oh, yes. Well, you're even tanner than I am, although you have a little bit more Mediterranean than I do. I'm a quarter Greek, and you're Lebanese, so you have slightly more melanin, I think, just by virtue of. I
That is
think you're one
true.
of those guys that just walks out in the sun and you can watch you getting tan.
Yeah, it's funny you say this because my
So,
daughter, who is lighter than the rest of us, uh, is always very frustrated because she goes 3, 2, 1, and Daddy's black. Because it literally is exactly what you
that's
said. I
funny.
just go for a 20-minute walk, I come back, and I'm like Yemenite. It's unbelievable.
That's really funny. All right, I'm going to read the epigraph for your book here. Let me just pull it up here. You got some nice blurbs, which is always nice. Hang on, let me get that epigram here for you. From Richard Laird, Happiness, Lessons from the New Science from a few years ago. We naturally look for the ultimate goal that enables us to judge other goals by how they contribute to it. Happiness is that ultimate goal because, unlike other goals, it is self evidently good. If we are asked why happiness matters, we can give no further external reason. It just obviously does matter. As the Declaration of Independence says, it is a self evident objective. Okay, is that true? I mean, your whole book kind of shows exactly what you can do to make yourself happier. So maybe it's not self evident. Maybe it's something you need to focus and work on.
Well, I think what's self-evident is, at least from what he's saying, is that we all have the ultimate goal of being happy. How you go about doing
Oh,
it is
I see.
hopefully where I can contribute.
I see. Yes. Okay. So this is like, was it Hume's statement that reason is always the slave to the passions, inasmuch as the reason can't tell you what goals you should have, but once you decide what goals you want, then reason can get you there.
Exactly right. And I should mention, this is actually the last chapter of the book where I use a quote from Viktor Frankl, who said, you don't directly pursue, in his case, he was talking about success. It's something that arises from you doing other things rather than you directly pursuing it. And I use that quote because I argue it's the same thing for happiness. So there isn't a sort of a module that you enter and you say, I'm going to seek ways to objectively maximize my happiness. But if you adopt certain mindsets, if you make certain correct decisions, at least it increases the likelihood of you being happy.
Interesting. That reminds me of in Pinker's book, Rationality. This idea: can you use rationality to prove that rationality is good? And he quotes Thomas Nagel saying that's one thought too many. It's just something you use. It's not, you don't use it to prove itself. And in that sense, happiness is sort of an ultimate goal. Okay, you're a social scientist. Social scientists like to operationally define things. What exactly are we talking about when we're talking about happiness?
Right. So that question certainly arises in the academic literature where you try to debate, are there, meaningful distinctions between happiness, contentment, well-being? Then there are others who come from an endocrinological perspective and say, well, pleasure and the dopamine, system is for short-term hits of quote happiness, hedonic happiness, but you need to go to serotonin to look for contentment or existential happiness. I mean, yeah, sure, we could talk about all these, but just intuitively, existential happiness means that if you were to poll me at any given point about, am I someone who wakes up at the start of the day, and I rub my hands together with glee, anticipating all the good stuff that's going to happen, or do I wake up thinking, oh my God, why am I so cursed that I have to live another day? That, if you'd like, in a very colloquial way, captures existential happiness. And that's what I mean. Are you someone who, in an enduring sense, are happy with your life or not?
And how are social scientists measuring that these days? And they used to use like a little pager where they'd ask you 6 times a day, how are you feeling on a scale of 1 to 7 or whatever.
Exactly. So that and by the way, with a lot of the kind of quantify yourself applications, you can now capture those measurements throughout the day. And there is a woman, I can't pronounce her last name. It's some sort of Polish sounding name. She's at UC Riverside. One
Yes.
Sonia Lubomir.
Yes. It's probably in your bibliography, but I know what
It
you
is in
mean.
my, I do cite her.
Yeah.
So she would have been one of the ones who does those sort of multiple temporal measurements. There are all sorts of accepted scales that have been used by a wide variety of scholars to measure.
Lubomirsky. Yeah, Lubomirsky. Let's give it. Let's get that right.
Okay, perfect. Thank you
Yeah.
for pronouncing it for me. Yeah, so there are all sorts of ways to measure happiness. As you probably know, some countries have even gone to measuring as part of the macro indicators the well-being or the happiness scores at the societal level as an integral part of the accounting of how well a society is doing. So it's not just about GDP, it's not just about income per capita. It's, is there a way for us to measure how flourished someone feels, how happy they feel? And so the guy I think who was involved in that was a professor at University of Michigan, if I'm not mistaken, in the social policy or something like that. His name escapes me, but yeah, there are all sorts of quantifiable ways to measure happiness.
Right. And how do you distinguish that from, say, pleasure versus eudaimonia? You talk about the difference between eudaimonia, the pursuit of meaning, versus hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure. And how do those two differ from what you're
Well,
talking about
that's
with
why I
happiness?
mentioned earlier the endocrinological framework, right? So the
Hmm.
pleasure stuff, the hedonism stuff is going to be the dopamine system, right? You watch porn, you might, I mean, literally feel better. You eat a juicy burger, that might make you feel better, but that's not what we mean. We're talking about, so eudaimonia, which of course the ancient Greeks had introduced, is about a longer lasting, meaningful sense of existential well being. So do I wake up every morning feeling that my life matters? I do things that people care about. Does that give me a sense of existential satisfaction? So I'm certainly meaning it in this grander sense. I'm not. I don't mean it. Let's go to hedonism too in Jamaica, wear toga, sheets, and have unlimited sex. Not that that's not a good thing, but that's certainly not what I mean in the book.
Yeah. So sometimes that's the phrase is subjective well-being that captures maybe a slightly broader set of emotions or something like that. I mean, when you're out doing your 10,000 steps a day, working out, I presume it's not always fun. You're not glowing with a big smile on your face, but when you're done, it feels good. You feel like, I'm a better person for this and so on. And that's what you mean.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Look, many of the things that ultimately give us that existential bliss are laden with, as you said, a lot of effort, a lot of difficulties. That's why I actually have a chapter that talks about persistence and the anti-fragility of failure, because the idea is that all things that ultimately will provide us with meaning are not going to be like cutting through warm butter. They're going to have obstacles. And so I have a whole bunch of great stories about some of the greatest people in different domains of excellence, whether it be J.K. Rowling or Lionel Messi or Michael Jordan, all of whom have stories of great rejection before they succeeded, right? And to my not to my dismay, but to my surprise, I recently discovered a podcast that the entire podcast is called "We Regret to Inform You," and it's a rejection podcast. I wish I had known of it as I was writing the book, because what they basically do is they take different stories, Ed Sheeran, South Park, Moonstruck the movie, Alan Ruck the actor, and what they show is that all of these eventual great stories of success were laden with endless rejection, and so nothing that is meaningful is likely going to come easily.
Right. I always like those stories. They're very moving. But of course, those are the ones that had lots of rejections and then they hit it big.
That's
What
right.
about the people that have lots of rejections and they just never hit it big, which is
That's
probably
true.
most of them?
Well, so I guess the way you should maybe look at that is that you don't put all of your eggs into the one happiness basket. If all of your happiness is linked to the fact that I want to be the next blockbuster movie superstar, and you fail, then you're likely going to be unhappy. But there are multiple pathways to being happy, right? So if all other things equal, I never make it as an actor, but I have an incredibly supporting wife and wonderful, loving children. Uh, I may not be maximally happy because I would also prefer to be a great actor, but at least there are multiple pathways by which I can instantiate my drive for happiness. So, just like diversification strategy works well in finance, diversification strategy works well in my pursuit of happiness.
Right. So having multiple avenues such that if one fails, you have some backup. Don't just focus on career. But career is pretty important. And, the power laws, where like 10% of the athletes make 90% of the money, or 10% of the singers make 90% of the money. Maybe it's even worse than that. Or since we're authors, it's like maybe 2% of the authors sell 98% of the books, something like that. So, most people, I want to be a successful author. Okay, that's nice. So do I. How do you do that? Well, you just try, but most people don't ever make it. So, what do you recommend, say, to a grad student says, I want to do what you're doing. I want to be a professor. I want to write books and so on. And then you say, well, go for it, okay. But if you have 20 people that want to do it and there's one job opening or two or something, what do you recommend in terms of you should have backup careers or what?
Right. So I'm going to answer in a slightly oblique way. So I would say don't word your objective as I want to be a successful author. Rather, talk about what that process entails. So regarding professions, I argue that there are let me step back. There are two important decisions that either are going to impart great misery or great happiness upon you. One is choosing the right spouse. Two is choosing the right profession, to your point. And I argue that all other things equal, the professions or the professional pursuits most likely to offer you purpose and meaning are those that allow you to instantiate your creative impulse. Now, what does creative impulse mean? It could mean I am a chef. It could mean I am an architect. It could mean I'm an author. It could be I'm a podcaster. There is something that I've done, that I've created, that people could now consume, and therefore that can grant me purpose and meaning precisely because I've instantiated my creative impulse. So the graduate student, I would tell him, do you want to spend a life knowing that many papers, I certainly have been in academia for now 30 years, most papers are going to go through endless rejections. Even Nobel Prize winning papers are typically defined by the fact that they were more rejected than not, precisely because they were so earth shattering that the orthodoxy completely put barriers to not accept them. So I wouldn't couch that pursuit in whether you're going to be successful or not. I would say, is this something that you want to be immersed in as a creative process? And if yes, go for it.
And if you have a good home life, whatever that is defined as for you as an individual, the setbacks in your career are lessened, let's say, or softened a bit if you can go home to somebody who loves you and that you love, and you have some kind of stability in your home life.
Oh, absolutely. So to that exact point, Michael, I was once at, I can't remember which conference it was at, like some major academic conference. And as I was walking with some colleagues, one of whom turned to me and said, how do you seem like, you can handle stress well and you deal with all kinds of, death threats and this and that. How do you do it? I say, well, because I get to go home and then there's this kind of safe sanctuary where I just have my children and my wife. At the time, I also had our Belgian shepherds, and I am untouchable there. There's only positivity, which incidentally is something that I have faced, that has been a source of great fear, because number one, I call it the dark cloud. I've always been afraid of the looming mortality of my dogs because they have a lesser lifespan than we do.
Mm-hmm.
And the other fear that I've had is the looming growing out of the age of innocence of my children as they get older.
Mm-hmm.
When they are very young, I want to bottle their innocence, because I can go out on social media and deal with all sorts of cretins and fight all sorts of fights. But then when you come home and you face the innocence of your children, that's wonderful. But then your children become obnoxious teenagers. And in a sense, you're facing that morning, which is they are no longer, there's the death of their pure innocence. Life makes them a bit less innocent. And so, that notwithstanding, as you've met my children, you've met my wife, they give me endless optimism to be able to go out and face the dark and ugly world.
Mm-hmm. Let's go through some of those variables since we're on marriage. What is it about marriage that's, not magic, that makes people happier and live longer and healthier and all that? What's the mechanism behind it?
Yeah, so it's a yeah, and you know this because you're also very well versed in the evolutionary literature. We as humans we face a really deep conundrum, right? Because on the one hand, we have evolved to engage in long-term coupling because we are officially a biparental species. While males invest less than females, we are certainly king dads in the mammalian sense. We really do invest a lot in our children. And therefore, it makes perfect evolutionary sense that we would have evolved all of the attachment mechanisms for long-term coupling, for romantic love. So Helen Fisher, whom you know well, is certainly someone who's talked about all the neuroanatomy of love and so on. So on the one hand, there are very clear evolutionary reasons for why we should be seeking the safety and the serotonin-driven mechanisms associated with long-term coupling. On the other hand, there are very clear evolutionary reasons why we should engage in or long for sexual variety seeking, which is actually something that I discuss in a later chapter. And so, on the one hand, from this side of my mouth, I want to be fully committed and loving and to my wife. But if on this side of my brain, I'm also, I mean, metaphorically speaking, I'm noticing all sorts of other lovely women that I would love to be have an opportunity to have access to. And so, it's a very, very difficult conundrum to navigate, but we've also evolved the Darwinian moral compass that we're endowed with, and so we can each decide what works best for us. In terms of why marriage works so well, for some of the reasons that we've mentioned earlier, it gives me safety, it gives me solace. Life is very difficult. I need to have a partner. My wife is my biggest champion. My children. I'll tell you a quick story about family champions. I gave a this huge talk at an event organized by Hillsdale College in Naples, Florida, 2 Februarys ago. Maybe 1,000 people in the audience, very high profile people, blah, blah, blah. It was on the parasitic mind, my last book. At the end of the talk, it was very well received. There was thunderous applause and so on. And as I walked off the stage, my daughter came up to me, hugged me, and she goes, "Daddy, I love you. I love you so much. I'm so proud of you." And she was, what, 13 then or 12? I tell you, Michael, that validation from my daughter was much greater than if a colleague, one of our prestigious fellow colleagues, were to come up to me and say, "I read the book and I love it." That's very nice and it's very important, but it wasn't as meaningful to me than your prepubescent daughter saying, "Wow, you are so cool. I love you." And so, for all sorts of reason, we're a social species. Marriages matter, families matter. And so it's no surprise that on average, married people are slightly happier than non-married people.
Hmm. And then what about the kind of practical aspect? There's somebody there reminding you to take your vitamins and don't eat the extra piece of cheesecake and don't forget to go to the doctor and all that stuff. And that adds up to maybe slightly longer life and slightly healthier on average.
I mean, that's literally the case in describing my journey of great weight loss, which I talk about in actually in the happiness book, right? I talk about it in the context of persistence and so on. But the reason why I mention it as a example of what you just said, so there were really two fundamental mechanisms that allowed me to lose a lot of weight. Number one, doing 15 to 20,000 steps a day, fine, but that only your exercise is about 10% of that what describes how much you're going to lose weight. 90% comes from what goes inside this big hole right here. Well, my wife kept track of every single calorie that I consumed in my weight loss journey. So she used myfitnesspal.com. I'm not being paid by them to say this. So this is an app that you can enter, literally down to the last calorie, and she'll say, "Okay, well, it's 8 o'clock at night. You're already at 1,636 calories. Don't have another snack because then you'll exceed your thing." And by having someone who was overseeing and to whom I was accountable regarding my calories daily, every single day, there was a culinary Gestapo agent that was checking everything that went into this gluttonous mouth of mine. that suddenly I wake up 18 months later, oh, look, I'm 80 plus pounds lighter. And so, to your point, having a fellow champion with you, boy, does that help.
So 80 pounds over how many months was that? 16,
86.
you said, or 18 months?
Yeah, so the heaviest I got was that I'm aware of. Maybe I was even more, but the heaviest weight that I've documented was 256, and I got down to 170. So the heaviest to the lightest was 86 pounds. I'm a bit now heavier. I'm about 4 or 5 pounds above that. And so I'm about mid 170s. So that took from January 1st, 2021 till about the summer of the 1.5 year later. So
Yeah,
about 18
okay.
months.
So lots of people do this. They're able to do it for a few weeks or a few months, and then they collapse, and it just all comes roaring back. So you must have hit several points like that. What did you do to
Did and
not fall for?
oh, that's it's a fantastic question. What I'm going to say once you say it is so self-evident, yet it's so hard to maintain, which is so here's the mindset I used. On any given day, Michael, there are three possible outcomes that can happen as relating to my weight. I mean, that's literally true. I could either increase my weight today, I could stay at the exact same weight, or I could decrease my weight. There's no other possibility. Yes. All I wanted to do was hopefully every day to either not change or go lower. Now, sometimes the going lower might not even be measurable. It might be below a just noticeable difference on my scale. But as long as I knew that every single day, the reality was that I was always going down, even if I hit a plateau, with enough time, the the results will show. And that really was the key difference between my attempts at losing weight this time and other times, because I would exactly fall prey to exactly what you said, which is I haven't lost any weight in 6 days. I'm starving myself. This sucks. Screw it. And then within 3 weeks after, you've put on the 18 pounds that you had spent 4 months losing. I just said, look, it doesn't matter. Every single day is part of the journey. And if I stay true to it, I never cheat, I never waver, I always have the Gestapo agent, holding me accountable, then I'm going to win. And that's what happened. Now, here's the trick. Since losing that weight, which now has been almost 2 years, I could have started putting it back on. So I've had to be just as judicious and just as assiduous in, being accountable to the scale.
Right. So the principle here is to not focus on the long-term goal, like I'm really got to lose 80 pounds because that's just too overwhelming. I just want to lose 1 pound this week, something like that, just a small goal.
I'll even make it smaller. I want to be no more than what I am this week, right? So, because you said 1 pound, maybe I'll fail at that. How about it's 0.25 of a pound? But is it not true that at the end of this week, I am better than last week? If it's yes, I win, right? So you could construct the objectives in any way that it can hopefully give you the momentums of consistent consecutive wins, right? But you're right. If I say, let me lose 80 pounds, no way. I'm never going to be able to do that. Give me the small goal. Let me stick to it week to week, and eventually I will win.
I did that the first time I did Race Across America from LA to New York. I had the whole goal of getting to the Empire State Building. The first day I was very excited. And then like the second, third day I woke up and from the short sleep break and get back on the bike. It's like New York City. Oh my God, I'm never going to. So I just said, okay, look, I'm going to just make it to that corn silo. I can see it. It's like 3 kilometers up the road. Maybe I'll just quit then. But if I'll just going to get to the corn silo, then I got there. It's like, okay, I'm going to make it to the Dairy Queen in the next town and have a blizzard. And then just boom, boom, boom. And then, state borders and so on. So just chunking, I think that's called, right? Just little
Yeah.
incremental. Oh, they call it small wins, right? This is why the business about, make your bed in the morning. Well, how could that be a big deal? Because it's one little thing. Okay, I made my bed. That's one thing. And then I'm going to do the next thing and the next thing.
Absolutely. It's so funny because a lot of these things, and I mean, now there are apps that I don't know, the Noon or Noom, whatever it's called, right? They
Mm.
implement these psychological mechanisms and these behavioral principles because ultimately that is what, mean, everything stems from your brain, right? And so if you don't implement the right strategy, the right mindset, the right decision, then you're going to lose. Cognitive behavior therapy is what, right? I'm holding on to the wrong set of cognitions. That's causing me a lot of anguish, mental anguish. Some skilled therapist comes along and says, well, let's revisit some of your cognitions and demonstrate that hopefully you're holding on to the wrong cognitions. Let's change those, and then suddenly your behavior will change. Voila, there's CBT. By the way, speaking of which, as I was doing my work, my research for this book, of course, I immersed myself in all of the, the literature of the ancient Greeks on, happiness and so on, and I was amazed to see the links between current CBT and what, for certainly the Stoics had exactly said the same stuff 2,000 years ago, which then reminds me of a quip. I know that you know him well. Nassim Taleb had, and I mentioned this in the book, and many years ago he had joked with me, kind of he was teasing me, ribbing on me. He said, I don't really know what you guys study, Gad, in behavioral science and psychology. Anything that has been meaningful to study about human nature, the ancient Greeks have already discovered. So what do you do all day? And so I said, haha, funny, Nassim. But then as I was doing my work for this book, I said, I think Nassim might be onto something. Because every time I thought I had this unique, brilliant insight, I'd say, shit, Epictetus has already said that 2,000 years ago. So it was quite a humbling experience.
Oh, yeah, the Stoics. I mean, they made quite a comeback here. There's a bunch of books on Stoicism I've been sent here. And it's just, so how did they do it? So they didn't have experimental science like we have. Is it just kind of deep reflection on human nature and just observations of what people actually do?
Exactly right. So the only step that they were missing is exactly what you said, which is we don't have the experimental design methodology and data and analytic approaches to validate those insights. But through deep introspection and acute observation, they came up with many of the most fundamental principles that we now have empirical validation for. So I'm just amazed. I mean, I always had reverence for, many of the famous ancient Greeks, but boy, did I get renewed reverence in preparing for this book. They're just unbelievable.
All right, let's talk about locus of control, internal locus of control versus external locus of control. So far, we've mostly been talking about external locus. You got the app, you got your wife, you've got the 10,000 steps you're recording. These are all kind of external rewards and drivers. At some point, you want to internalize it where you don't really even think about it anymore. It's just second nature. It's just who you are. And so it doesn't feel like, oh, I got to work out today or, oh, I got to lose weight. Like it's a grind, but instead, this is just who I am. It's what I do. How do you do that?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. So just to add to that construct, uh, Rotor, I think is how you pronounce his name. Rotor was the original guy, or Rotter, Rottr, was the guy who came up with the first scale to measure internal versus external locus of control. For your listeners or viewers who may not know this, internal locus of control is I did well on the exam because I'm smart. External locus of control is I did well on the exam because the professor gave us an easy exam. You either attribute the outcome internally to your disposition or to external events. Now, interestingly, I know you know this, Michael, but I thought it'd be interesting for your audience.
Yeah,
What
please.
most people do is they attribute successes internally and failures externally. So I did very well on the exam because I'm smart. I did very poorly on the exam because Professor Shermer is an unfair asshole, right? So now the only group of people who don't do this, it turns out. Do you know the answer to this, Michael, by the way?
No, go ahead. No, please.
It clinically depressed people don't
Mm.
suffer from that rosy attributional style. And so it turns out that the question then becomes the chicken or egg. Is it because they are innately less rosy about their attribution style, which makes them more susceptible to depression? Or is it that once they are facing a bout of depression, therefore the rosy lenses are removed? And really, the evidence is that there's a bit of both. It's not clear. But to your question, look, ultimately, anything that's meaningful has that you want to pursue has to have an internal element, because for it to persist over the long run, I can't be chasing external validation. So, for example, well, would the speedometer on my phone, in your view, be an external factor or an internal one? I am responding to it, But what's making me
Mm,
respond to it is my internal drive to hit
sure.
that
Yes.
15,000.
Yes, I see. I see. Right. Okay, so that's an artificial distinction then.
That's
But
right.
at some point, here's what I was thinking of. These weight loss drugs that everybody's doing now. I forget the names of them, but um, but we don't know what happens when you go off it after 3 months. Does the weight come roaring back because you actually haven't changed your need for food or how much you want to eat? The drugs suppress your appetite, so you just don't eat. But what happens when you stop taking the drugs? The appetite comes back. Ultimately, you'd want some kind of internal the thermostat to have been
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
cranked down permanently, so you don't internally desire to eat that much. Something like that for all forms of emotional control. I
I
think.
like this additional explanation you gave, because I actually have faced this on a personal level, and I'll just mention two quick anecdotes. Number one, I've always struggled with the idea of people who do the bariatric weight loss surgery, precisely because then for me it invalidates the purity of them implementing the behavioral changes that they need to. In a sense, it's a form of cheating, right? I'm going to reduce the size of your stomach, and that will then force you to get thinner. It's not because you've actually had any sense of self control. But on a personal level, I have faced what you're talking about when it comes to my physician having said many years ago, your cholesterol level is too high. We need to put you on statins. And I always thought, being very much of an internal locus of control person, but to me, that sounds fraudulent, because if I am
Hmm.
a strong person, I should be able to implement the behavioral changes. Maybe I'll eat more salmon and that will help. Maybe I will eat, not that I eat so much processed foods, and then eventually my physician explained that, look, you come from a family that genetically produces a lot more LDL than most. Now, I'm not getting into the debate of whether statins work or we care about them or not, but if we assume that they are valid as a intervention strategy, it took me a very long time before I accepted being put on statins, because to me, I always felt that no, I should be able to make the right decisions to have my cholesterol scores at the level that I need them to be. And then my physician gave me a way out by saying, but for many people who have a genetic predisposition, you really are fighting against your genes. So just put the odds on your side.
I like that. Since you mentioned depression, wasn't there some research a few years back that depression leads people to actually get out of bad situations? In other words, there's kind of an evolutionary
Yeah.
argument that it is adaptive in the sense that something is wrong in your life and this is a signal. And therefore, maybe depressed people, to your external locus of control, have a more realistic view of life. It just is hard.
Yeah, what a great question. So I recently had on my show Randy Nesse. Are you familiar with him, Michael?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Or
Yes,
you,
yeah, I am.
have
I
you
don't
had
know
him on
him
the show?
personally, and I've
Oh, you
not
know,
talked to
okay.
him, but no, I haven't.
Yeah.
No,
So
yeah, but I love
Randy
that
Ness,
stuff. Yeah.
yeah. So Randy Nesse is first. I mean, his claim to fame, at least academically, is that he's been trying to Darwinize the medical curriculum, right? So he wrote a book with George Williams, a famous evolutionary biologist who has since passed away, called Why We Get Sick, from a Darwinian perspective, right? How is fever adaptive? Well, you can take the principles of evolutionary medicine and apply them to the specialty of psychiatry, which would be evolutionary psychiatry. And it exactly speaks to your point about depression being an adaptive response. So you could look at a wide range of mental health disorders as via an evolutionary lens. So whether it be phobias, whether it be OCD, whether it be depression, they are very compelling. And these are not speculative, unfalsifiable, just so stories, as we're often told is all that evolutionary thinking is. These are very, very powerful, unique ways to study how the body and mind can go wrong, and understanding the Darwinian why of that happens. So I'm fully on board. By the way, I published several papers in medical journals looking at the evolutionary roots of various psychiatric disorders. Perhaps most relevant to your audience, I looked at sex differences in the symptomology of OCD. So the idea being that there are some obsessions in OCD that are more likely to be common to men, others that are more common to women, and others that exhibit no sex differences. Same thing for the C's, the compulsions. And then the idea is there an evolutionary reason for why we should expect some of the O's and the C's to exhibit a sex-specific etiology or not? And
Hmm.
and I predicted that there would be. Now, I didn't come from the perspective of having been a priori an OCD researcher, but I was armed with the evolutionary lens, and that allowed me to then make certain a priori predictions, even though I didn't know much about OCD, and I was proven to be correct because I had the explanatory power and parsimony of the evolutionary lens.
Well, don't leave us hanging. What's the gender difference or sex
Oh,
difference?
okay. Sorry about that. So take for example, so ruminative thinking would be a manifestation of OCD. So ruminative thinking. So look, in let's say in germ contamination OCD, I think that my hands are contaminated, and so I will repeatedly wash my hands with scaldingly hot water for 8 hours so that the skin is falling off my hands, but I can't stop that ritual, right? Now, in ruminative thinking, instead of having the fear of germ contamination, there is an intrusive thought that keeps going in my head. Did I say something at yesterday's party that was really idiotic? And now every single person in that party thinks I'm the dumbest idiot who's ever lived. So now the way you wash yourself metaphorically is that you start going to every single person at the party trying to assuage your fear. So I didn't say anything wrong. I didn't say, right? Now, many of these ruminative thoughts that men exhibit are related to, did I say something at yesterday's party that is related to loss of status, right?
Hmm.
So that particular manifestation of a ruminative thought in OCD does have a sex specific etiology, right? On the other hand, there is this ruminative thought of, what if I just pick up a knife and I just stab my newborn and kill it? That is much more likely to happen to women because there is such a thing as paternity uncertainty, but there is no such thing as maternity uncertainty. So I kind of go through a lot of these examples and demonstrate under which conditions we should expect no sex differences and under which conditions we should expect more male or more female. Does that make sense?
Oh, how interesting. Yeah. So sort of an extension of normal ruminative behavior. If I'm pulling out of the driveway and I think, oh, shoot, did I lock the front door? Did I leave the stove on? Maybe I go back and check once. Everything is okay. So, but maybe if I do it twice or three times, then all of a sudden it goes from normal to disruptive and abnormal.
Right.
Is that
So
what you
if
mean?
now,
It's an
so if
extension
I
of that.
use that, you're exactly right. So now I'm going to talk about OCD from an evolutionary perspective without complicating with the sex specificity that I mentioned earlier. So the general story about why OCD, how we could study OCD from an evolutionary perspective is the following. OCD is the maladaptive, the hyperactive scanning of environmental threats. So the distinction here is, so to your point of if I check once, it's good. If I check 73 times, it's no longer good. It's that it's the hyperactivation of an otherwise adaptive mechanism. And I use that exact principle in several of my evolution book, The Consuming Instinct, The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption. I argue that many forms of dark side consumption, pathological gambling, eating disorders, pornographic addictions, excessive suntanning, they are hyperactive manifestations of otherwise adaptive processes. So let me give you a specific example. Uh, Compulsive buying is a largely female-based affliction. While I predicted, even before I got into the compulsive buying literature, when I was writing my first book, I predicted that women who suffer from compulsive buying were not compulsively hoarding lawnmowers. They were not compulsively hoarding stamps. They were compulsively hoarding, and it turned out to be true, beauty products. So you start off with the adaptive mechanisms of beautifying yourself in the mating market. You make that process hyperactive, and voila, it becomes a psychiatric disorder.
So porn addiction would be slightly more male than female.
A lot
I
more
mean,
male than female.
this is what I've read. I really have no idea what I'm talking about here. I read a book about Yeah. So there, like, to pick that as an example, what's wrong with watching porn? Nothing. Well, but what if that's all you do all day? You lose your job, your wife leaves you. It's like, well, then maybe that's a problem.
And you can no longer sexually perform because it's very vanilla, the sex that you're having in your monogamous union, whereas you're used to,
Hmm.
you know, swinging arms and 17 people in your favorite fetish porn. And so you become habituated to those stimuli, and you can no longer handle the quote monotony of your, you know, day-to-day vanilla sex. And so, yeah. By the way, each of those dark side consumption examples that I gave you has a universal sex specific etiology. So, pornographic addictions, almost always male. Pathological gambling, almost always male. Compulsive buying, almost always female. Eating disorders, almost always female. Obsessive sun tanning, whether it be artificial sunbeds or natural sun, almost always female. Excessive risk taking, almost always male. There is no culture that's ever been discovered where that manifestation doesn't happen. And not only is it universal across cultures, it's universal to the extent that we have that data across time periods. So Hippocrates had documented eating disorders with the exact same epidemiology as what we have today. So the idea that eating disorders are simply due to the thin ideal media images is complete bullshit.
Hmm. Yeah. So in your chapter on variety, and since you mentioned sexual variety, and the male female differences. So men want to have more partners than women, and they're willing to be intimate after fewer dates and so on. I had David Buss on the show. You know his book When Men Behave Badly.
Of
I mean,
course.
the numbers, these surveys from these dating sites are unbelievable. I mean, the ends of 2 million people took the survey or whatever. Like, how many partners would you like to have in the next 10 years? For the men, it was like 5 times as many as the women. And how many dates would you need to go on before you'd be intimate with somebody when you swipe right or whatever? For women, it was 7 dates. For the men, I think it was less than one. So for every guy that said 2 dates, some guy said, "Why have a date?" Right. So so variety is good. But what if you're in a monogamous relationship and you're a guy and you still have those impulses? And I was just listening to RFK Jr. on, I think it was Barry Weiss's podcast, and she asked him about this because he said somewhere publicly, yeah, I used to have a cheat on my wife or whatever. It's this flaw in my brain. I just think about having sex with other women. It's like, dude, that's all guys think like that. Just the question is, do you act on it or not? Right. And so so variety is good, except maybe when it's not. So how do you advise people on that?
Right. So that's why in the chapter on variety seeking, I made sure to give completely different domains where variety seeking is something that we can pursue. So there's food variety seeking, there's exercise type variety seeking, there's sexual variety seeking, and one that's close to my heart as an intellectual is intellectual variety seeking, and I get into all that kind of stuff. Uh, the reason why the chapter is titled, variety is the spice of life, in in brackets sometimes or something, it's precisely because in the sexual domain, it's not clear that more variety is always better than less variety. The penchant is there, but look, we are an animal that also recognizes that there are pros and cons to every action that we take. There are consequences and repercussions. Do I find tons of women very beautiful? Do I have access to many women who'd be willing to have sex with me? The answer to all of these is yes. But maybe for better or worse, I come equipped with a pathological sense of right or wrong. I think that I think I've got the game of being a player, but I don't have the moral detachment to be a player. And that even if my wife were to never find out that I cheated on her, I couldn't live with myself that I have violated those norms. And so for me, notwithstanding that, yes, it's frustrating that I don't get to sleep with all sorts of other women that would be willing to do so. I sleep well at night knowing that I've been true to my wife. My wife is beautiful. I wouldn't want to do something that jeopardizes the union that we have. So I don't think there is a unique, one prescription fits all. That's why I put the sometimes in that chapter, because the sexual domain is where we really face a conundrum. Because, by the way, as you know, Michael, it's not just men that desire sexual variety seeking. Yes, men desire it a lot more than women, But in the book, I discuss many triangulated evidence that suggests that women are also deeply desirous of philandering. And maybe I could mention a few of these. Would that be relevant to
Yeah,
the
please. Yeah, yeah,
so
yeah. Yeah,
here's one.
please.
Women are more likely to cheat when they are maximally fertile, and they're less likely to insist on using protection when they are fertile, when they are cheating. So you would think that if I cheat, I don't want to be stuck with a child that's not my husband, and yet I'm less likely to take protection. This is called the shopping for good genes strategy, right? Usually women will cheat with someone who is of superior genetic stock. So number one. Number two, this is from the work of Robin Baker, who some have argued that the research is flawed, but he has rebuttals to it. This is called the sperm war hypothesis, which basically argues that there are three
Yes.
phenotypes of sperm. There is the usual fertilizer, which we all have seen, but then there are the blocker sperms and the killer sperms. The blocker sperms take position at the entrance of the cervical tract of women, hoping to stop other men's sperm from coming in. The killer sperms don't care at all about the egg. They just go around in the reproductive tract looking for other men's sperm to kill. Now, sperm is viable within the reproductive tract of a woman for roughly 72 hours. So if that theory is right, if men have evolved the chemical weaponry to block other men's sperm and kill other men's sperm, that means evolutionarily speaking, our female ancestor could have stood very good chances of having mated with multiple men within 72 hours. I'll give one other piece of evidence. This is from a paper in the early 80s I think it was the early 80s, where they tracked the size of a primate's testes as a function of female promiscuity in that species, right? So a male anatomical feature as intimate as the size of their testes is an adaptive response to female behavior. And it turns out that, for example, chimpanzees are walking testicles, right? They've got these huge, massive testicles because the females mate with countless men or males. On the other hand, mountain gorillas, these majestic males that are 400 pounds, that are 10 times more powerful than men combined, have very small testes because, theoretically speaking, even though there is a bit of cheating going in the bushes, theoretically speaking, the dominant male then monopolizes sexual access to all of his harem of females, in which case there isn't much sperm competition and therefore their testes are smaller. So where do human males fit on that curve? Well, we tend to fit closer to the bigger testicles. And so for
Mm.
all sorts of converging evidence, this demonstrates that human females are actually quite open to the idea of sexual variety.
And the sperm wars hypothesis is held up pretty well in replication studies.
So I've heard both sides, so I don't have a definitive final. I actually had tried to invite Robin Baker on my show several years ago. He very graciously had replied and said, "Oh, I would have loved to come on your show. I'm retired, Gad. I'm no longer doing any of this stuff." And then I had asked him, I said, "So I'd like to know, Robin. I mean, I've heard a lot of compelling evidence that suggests that your hypothesis stands. I've heard a lot of evidence that says it's all bunk." And then he had shared with me some rebuttals that he had written suggesting that it still very much holds true. So based on at least what he has argued, it's definitely stood the test of time. But, I don't have a meta-analysis to suggest that it does or not.
I was gonna. This reminds me of the movie City Slickers, which I wrote about one of my books here, where Billy Crystal, Daniel Stern, and Bruno Kirby go on a Montana cattle drive. And there's much talk and discussion about the purpose of life, the meaning and death, and especially sex. Crystal's character, Mitch, for example, explains to Phil and Ed that women need a reason to have sex. Men just need a place. Ha ha ha. Despite this comedic observation, Mitch has been happily and faithfully married to his wife, Barbara, for many years. By contrast, Phil has been in a miserable marriage to his boss's daughter and just got busted by his wife for having an affair with the young checkout clerk. Ed is a consummate playboy bachelor who recently, although somewhat reluctantly, tied the knot with his latest flame. As is often the case among men, the talk turns to sex and infidelity. Ed wants to know if Mitch would cheat on Barbara if he wouldn't get caught. Mitch reminds him of what just happened to Phil. He just got caught. So Ed offers this scenario. Okay, a spaceship lands and the most beautiful woman you ever saw gets out. And all she wants to do is have the best sex in the universe with you. And the second it's over, she flies away for eternity. No one would ever know. You're telling me you wouldn't do it? And Mitch says, no, because what you're describing actually happened to my cousin Ronald. And his wife did find out about it at the beauty parlor. That's right.
That's very good. I don't
It's
know
such a guy thing. Yeah.
I don't know if you know the quote. I think it was Wilt Chamberlain who, I'm slightly paraphrasing,
Oh,
but
yes.
you know what? Someone told him, "My God, what a man you are for having had sex with 20,000 women," and he retorted, and perfect insight. He said, "Well, it takes a lot more of a man to have sex with the same woman 20,000 times." That
Mm.
basically is the
Oh,
Coolidge
nice.
effect right there, right?
Oh, rice. Yeah, nice. Like, okay, speaking of evolution, let's talk behavior genetics. To what extent is the variation among people on happiness, and if you want to throw in personality and emotions as well, is accountable by your genes? Some people are just born happier. Some people are just born grumpy and always in a bad mood. What's the research on that, and what can you do about it?
Yeah, fantastic question. And I exactly addressed that very early in the book, precisely because I didn't want people to say, well, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm born with a sullen disposition. So the research is the following, Michael. About 50% of the individual differences in happiness stem from our genes. 50%. So at first you might say, oh, that kind of sucks. But no, that means that there's 50% up for grabs. That means, yes, I may be on the continuum. I start off with a sunnier disposition than you, you might be more sullen. Okay, fine. But then if I don't make the right decisions, if I don't adopt the right mindsets from my happier, sunnier, innate disposition, you might end up overtaking me on your way to summiting Mount Happiness. So 50% due to genes, 50% due to the environment, and therefore the book and all of its prescriptive content is about that 50% that's up for grabs.
Right. So, what are some of the tools somebody could use to engage in every day? Like, I just wake up and I'm grumpy. I know I shouldn't be this way. What do I do?
Right. So, I mean, it depends what's making you feel grumpy, but one of the strategies that I've used, which really uh, ties some of the stuff that I've written about in this book with the stuff that I've written in The Parasitic Mind. So, in the first chapter of The Parasitic Mind, I talk about the horrors of my childhood, growing up in the Lebanese Civil War and blah, so on. Uh, Perhaps paradoxically, but maybe not if you stop and think about it, those very difficult circumstances that I faced in my childhood allow me to actually be happier today. Why? Because I can take anything that is causing me, stress and anguish in my day to day and contextualize it against what may have been had I not miraculously escaped Lebanon. And then suddenly, whatever is pissing me off seems quite trivial, right? So let me give you a quick example of these kinds of mindset tricks that we can play. As I was, embarking on, a very, very full schedule of media tour and travel and all this to promote the forthcoming book, I woke up a couple of days ago feeling a lot of anguish and kind of dread. Oh my God, I've got to go here. I've got to do there. And then I stopped myself. I said, wait a second. Are you, this is my internal voice. Are you genuinely whining to yourself about the fact that a bunch of really wonderful people are going to invite you on their shows and give you a forum to speak about cool ideas? And are you really whining about the fact that you've got a book coming out that's causing you anguish? Why don't you think back about what you escaped in Lebanon? And then genuinely, that made me kind of come out of my stupor, right? Which is, what am I whining about? And so there are all sorts of mindsets that we can, adopt that can really hopefully get us out of our day-to-day funk.
So it's like a reframing. Something negative happens. One of my favorite videos on this is Jocko Willnick's "Good." You've probably seen this one. Where he says, you didn't get the high speed gear, you didn't get the mission, you didn't get the job, whatever. Good. Opportunity to grow, opportunity to learn, opportunity to improve yourself, and so on and so on. But it's hard to do,
It is.
when you've had 3 or 4 little setbacks during the day. I mean, just little stuff. Like typically, what sets me off is I'll get up in the morning and I'll have, okay, today I'm going to do these 6 things. And then, I don't even get to the first one because 3 or 4 things happen that, there's traffic or this happens and I got to run this errand. And all of a sudden I'm 3 hours behind to get my 6 and I haven't got the first one yet. And I find it kind of bubbling up like, "Urgh." And it's hard to reframe and go, yeah, this is so good. It's like, no, it's not good. It's frustrating.
No, I mean, to your point about intrusions into your daily freedom or daily navigation. In the chapter where I talk about the 2 most important decisions that you'll make, the choosing the right spouse and choosing the right profession. When I'm talking about choosing the right profession, I mentioned that you want to be immersed in instantiating your creative impulse. Another element to choosing the right profession is temporal freedom. There's a lot of incredible research that speaks to the fact that what makes someone on a day-to-day basis happy at their work or not. Now, I knew this already anecdotally from my personal life, but it was nice to see that it was supported by the academic literature. Uh, Imagine that you are a factory worker working on the line, whereby your temporal freedom is so eradicated that you are mandated from the union or the employer when you can take a bathroom break, right? So that's really a constraint on your daily autonomy, right? On the other hand, I lead a very, quote, stressful life in that I do a million things a day. There's a lot of responsibilities. I'm a full-time professor with a full-time lab, and I do a million other things. But I never feel stressed as long as there aren't too many restrictions on my day schedule, right? I always joke with my wife that I get more stressed if I have 3 meetings in a day. Like I have to go to a departmental meeting, then I have to meet this student from 1 to 2, and then that will stress me more than if I have to go on Joe Rogan and speak in front of 20 million people. Why? Because the violation or the constraint on my temporal movement really suffocates me. It's a form of kind of scheduling asphyxia. I can't stand it, right? And so there is really a lot of research to speak about what you feel when your day is slowly being sucked out of you. And this is why, for me, being an academic has brought me great solace and happiness beyond just the fact that it allows me to live a life of thought, but it's because no one is on me other than when I have to teach, telling me what to do from this time to that time. If I want to work 16 hours today until 4 o'clock in the morning on some passage in my book, I'll do it and I'll wake up later the next day. And that temporal freedom is all the richness for me.
I agree. I could never work for anybody else. I just kind of realized early in my 20s that the only job I could have would be the professorial job because I'm in college and I can see what they do. And they have so many degrees of freedom. I mean, you have occasional committee meetings or whatever, but these and the structured classes, you have to be there at the class at a certain time. But compared to people with real jobs, so to speak, they have to be there 9 to 5 in the lunch break. Yeah. So that obviously that appeals to people with different temperaments, I suppose. Do you want to comment on like the big 5 personality and where happiness fits in, like openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, introversion? Are there any interactive effects there?
Oh yes. So in one of the chapters of the book, I go through a litany of correlates to happiness. So what does the literature say about religiosity and happiness? What does the literature say
Yeah,
about
let's do that. Yeah.
right? And so to your point about personality, there is a lot of compelling evidence from many different sources, including big meta-analyses that correlate certainly the big 5 with happiness scores. So, for example, neuroticism is negatively correlated with happiness. Openness is positively correlated to happiness. Not surprisingly, agreeableness is positively correlated with happiness, and so on. So, yes. So, the short of it is big 5 highly correlated with happiness. Absolutely. Religiosity. Now, both you and I are not particularly of the religious type, but the research does show that there is a moderate correlation between religiosity and happiness. So, meaning more religious people are on average happier. But being someone who's a non-believer, I wanted to give hope to those who are not religious, and so they don't think that they're behind the eight ball when it comes to happiness because they're, let's say, atheists. I argue that there are all sorts of ways by which we can instantiate our spiritual needs, our quest for the divine, without it being couched in a sort of supernatural ethos. So this conversation is a manifestation of the spiritual. I'll tell you a quick story that happened in Portugal that speaks to that, which, I may not call it religious, but it is certainly a spiritual, divine manifestation of communal sociality. So I had just arrived to Lisbon with my family. We had spent about 12 days in the Algarve region, which is the southern Portugal, and now we were going to visit for a few days Lisbon. And we were by the waterfront in Lisbon, and I noticed a gentleman was kind of staring at me. I figured, oh, it's probably a fan or something. This often happens, and so he very gingerly said, "Excuse me, do you mind if I ask you for a request?" I said, "Sure." He goes, "Do you mind? I'm doing a project. I take a photo of people that I meet randomly on the street, and then I ask them their two top roads to happiness." And so I said, "Well, as it turns out, I have a book on happiness coming out in, whatever it was then, 2 weeks from now. It's now next week." And then we sat and had this lovely, maybe 10 or 15-minute intimate conversation that probably was one of the highlights of my trip. And I saw a lot of topographical beauty in Portugal, beautiful mountains and beautiful clear water and all kinds of beautiful food. But that moment of spontaneous, serendipitous communality was, in a sense, a religious experience. So yes, it is true that religiosity in the regular sense is correlated with happiness, but I think we could be happy even if we are heathen non-believers.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's like saying, well, humans have a sex drive, so we need Playboy clubs. Well, Playboy clubs may be one way, but there's lots of other avenues. Religion is too big a word. It's like, let's drill down into that. What is it about that? Now, of course, believers think, well, God's rewarding me for believing, but making me happier and live longer and so on. But no, of course, there's some social element to it. We know that humans are a social primate species, and that having a loving relationship, having close friends, having a social circle, all that is better than eating kale, working out, not smoking, and all that Harvard longitudinal study that's been going on since 1939, has kind of borne all that out. It's amazing how important that is. So maybe the structure of religion brings that out more, and pretty effectively. We know, for example, that religious people donate more money and give more blood and so on. But the atheist spouse of the religious person also donates money, and so they get pulled along. It's more of the kind of the structure to that. And since one of the elements of religion, particularly in the West, is to emphasize marriage and fidelity and truth telling and all the Ten Commandments and so on. And since we were talking about marriage, and it's kind of on the decline, right? So the generation Z, the Zoomers, so to speak, or iGen, they're not dating as much. They're not getting married as much, and so on. Are you worried how that might affect? I'm just thinking in real time here as we're talking, because there's this spike in depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, cutting, and so on. Everybody's been talking about amongst these Generation Z, iGeners. And I wonder if it's because of this lack of structure, not religion per se, but just more the kind of fundamental principles of life that they're just slow to develop.
Right. Before I answer that question, you mentioned the Harvard longitudinal study, and I want to
Oh,
be
yeah.
as polite and kind as possible here. The current director of that longitudinal study was on my show recently, and he was arguably the worst, not arguably, definitively the absolute worst guest that I've ever had. He was, and he wrote a
What?
book
Really?
called
Who?
I don't mind mentioning his name. I'm not trying to be rude, but I mean, hey, if you carry yourself in certain ways, you deserve the consequences of your actions. His name is Robert Waldinger. You should go and watch our chat I ended up
I
cutting
had the co-author on my show. The other author. There's two authors. The Good
right
Book, right? The Good Life.
the good life, and so
I
so
don't know
I
him. I didn't talk to him.
oh my God, just go and watch our chat. I cut it short. I stopped it after about 30 minutes. I was incredibly gracious. I was very polite. I didn't put on my fighting gloves because I do adhere to the uh, perhaps Middle Eastern code, perhaps the GAD code of if you're a guest on my show, hospitality rules, and therefore I'm going to be fully gracious and polite. But my God, it amazes me that someone who writes a book about the good life, who is the head of the Harvard longitudinal study on adult development, whom I quoted in my current book on happiness about the importance of sociality and good relationships, that he could be so rude, such a gargantuan. I won't fill in the rest. You can go watch it and you'll tell me what you think if you want privately. That just
Wow.
amazed me.
Wow.
Incidentally, I had reached out as I was starting to write my book on happiness to many of the key uh, researchers in the happiness sphere because I had become familiar with their research. To the last one, they were some of the most miserable, rude people I have ever interacted with. So I truly wonder whether, in some sort of Freudian way, they got into the happiness, research stream because they are so
Trying to find
profound.
it.
Exactly.
That's
But I
really
mean,
funny.
I literally mean that not to be facetious. I mean, some of the some very, very well-known psychologists who operate in the happiness. So I would write them this long email, very polite, talking, and the responses I would get were so dismissive, so rude, so astounding that you really wonder how they could have ever published a paper on happiness. But okay, to come to your other question, uh, I think a lot of the difficulty that some of the younger generations are having in the mating game is because many of the natural dynamics that are a central feature of the mating ritual have now been pathologized, right? Well, first of all, if you tell half the population that they are pathological in their existence, right? You are toxically masculine. You pathologize masculinity. Well, that already is not a very good thing for a sexually reproducing species. Now, if you also have seminars at all universities now because of the hashtag Me Too movement, where you're teaching us that, a compliment that is perhaps worded in the wrong way is a form of sexual assault, then it may not be surprising that many young men are afraid of their shadows and are not going to be willing to approach. I mean, all of Italy basically engages in mating rape. I mean that facetiously because we know that Italian men tend to pursue women and woo women and compliment women. Well, all those suddenly in the hashtag Me Too seminars that we all have to now take would all be forms of sexual harassment. Now, I'm not trying to be facetious. It is really the case that many women have written to me privately saying, is there a cure for why men have become such wimps? I go to a place, I want to be approached by desirable men, and I go home without anybody having approached me. Well, is it surprising that men are afraid to approach you because they might be accused of sexual harassment? Yes, of course, we know that sexual harassment is evil. We know that sexual assault is evil, but there is a natural dynamic where a man pursues you persistently. Well, if now you tell him that that's part of hashtag Me Too, then maybe we're all going to be twiddling our fingers in frustrated celibacy at home.
But I did want to get your opinion on this larger issue of this generational difference between Gen Zs and this apparently real issue since maybe 2015 or so of this huge spike. Three times as many girls as no, sorry, three times as many Gen Z versus the previous generation have depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and so on. For men, it was like 1.5 times. So the spike seems to be there. The data seems to be consistent. What's not clear is the reason. Social media, screen time, Facebook, fear of missing out, that kind of stuff. Or is it the coddling by parents, the helicopter parenting, so they're fragile rather than anti-fragile? And there's theories bouncing around. Different books are being written on this. What are your thoughts on what's wrong with the kids these days?
Well, so here I'm totally entering speculative world because I don't have a definitive answer, right? I mean, I'm someone who has a
Maybe
good
nobody
sense.
does.
Sorry?
Yeah,
Yeah, but
maybe nobody does yet.
yeah, exactly. So I've heard the sort of Jonathan Haidt, the spike happened because of social media. I've heard that argument. I've heard also, as you said, there are all sorts of theories floating out there. My sense is each of those is probably operative. The only thing that we don't know is how much weight to attribute to each of those causes. So I don't think it is factor A to the exclusions of factors B, C, and D. I think all of the ones that I've heard of seem to be operative. The only thing that I can't decide is the extent to which we should attribute 40% of the weight to one versus another. I know I'm not trying to offer you a cop out answer, but that's the best of what I know on this matter.
Yeah, I liked Jean Twangy's answer to this. Her book is Generations,
Yes.
and she's got an interesting thesis. I don't know if you've had her on your show yet, but she's compares, like the last century of generations, and her theory is life history theory, and that technology led to us doubling of the lifespan from say 35 or 40 to 75 to 80 or so in the last century, due to public health and vaccines and just everything, diet and whatnot. And as a consequence, if you live longer, you don't have to rush into having children or have as many children. So it's sort of the R selected versus K selected.
Yes.
R selected species have lots of offspring, throw them out there and hope one of them gets to the next generation. K selected, like elephants, you only got one. So you got to put all your resources in that one. So her argument is that current generations, like the stat she had was, I think boomer women got pregnant for the first time on average at age 19. It's now 29. It's 10 years later. And that the mechanism is that the norms just completely shift, such that if none of your friends are getting married and pregnant at age 19 or 20, why would you bother? And everybody, all your friends go to college, they get careers, and you just kind of do what your friends do and so on. Everything takes longer, and you only have one or two, so you got to put all your resources. So the helicopter parenting, her theory is not what I thought it was the spike in crime. So of course that's a rational argument. You got to protect your kids. No, it's just that you only have the one, so you got to put all your resources into it. So they're coddled, which would lead to your anti-fragility. They're fragile, not anti-fragile.
Right. Well, I had not heard of that theory. She's the one who wrote the earlier book on the narcissism epidemic, correct? Is that her?
I think so. Her previous book was iGen, and then she had another book before that. I forget what it's
I
called,
think
but
that's
she's
the
the
one.
social psychologist at UC San Diego. She studies,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
could
Okay.
be.
No, I haven't had her on my show, but I know who she is, or at least I'm familiar with her work. Although I was not familiar with the life history theory as applied to what we're talking about. I love that because, of course, anytime that I see some evolutionary framework that is being used in some meaningful way, I'm happy. I actually talk about R versus K selection in all sorts of contexts, including in a consumer context. So I
Yeah.
mean, it sounds plausible what she's saying. I'd have to read more about it, but it sounds very intriguing what she's saying. I like it.
Okay, here's what you write in your book: National differences in happiness. Top 10 countries in the 2012 inaugural rankings were Denmark, Finland, Norway, the Netherlands, Canada, Switzerland, Sweden, New Zealand, Australia, and Ireland. 2021 rankings were strikingly similar: Finland, Denmark, Switzerland, Iceland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Luxembourg, New Zealand, and Austria. I know Canada didn't make it in the 2021. Why are there national differences? And just talk about like individual versus more collectivist, cultures, or tight versus loose cultures, or I don't know what's being measured there. What's
Well, there
the
are
independent variable? Let's say.
yeah, there are all sorts of reasons why we get national differences, and if anybody had the sort of the final definitive thing, they would be heading to Stockholm to collect the Nobel Prize. So I don't think there's a definitive thing. One argument for why those particular, and I actually quote from that study in what you just quoted, if there is a quote that talks about, when you have high trust in a society where you have a sufficient social safety net, all kinds of things like that, you end up having higher happiness scores. But what might be true at the collective level may not hold true at the individual level within that culture. And I'm a perfect manifestation of that. Why? because for the collective social safety net to operate, you need to parasitize those who make the most money and then redistribute that money to all the others. So 99% of people are incredibly happy with the criminal parasitic taxation system of Quebec and Canada, precisely because they get all of those benefits, but someone has to pay for those benefits. Guess who pays for those benefits? The parasitic mind book royalties, right? So then someone comes to me and says, hey, your words, your thoughts, your humorous anecdotes, your lived experiences in Lebanon, the royalties from that don't belong to you. 58% of those royalties belong to us. And now the beneficiary of that theft is then very happy. So I have a mixed sort of feeling to some of those results because, yes, at the collective level, it's nice that we can have, quote, free healthcare, but it's not free healthcare. Somebody's paying for it, and it's called Your Guest Got Saad. But I don't pay just for me. I pay for everybody else. So no, I'm not very happy in Canada.
Oh, Gad, you're talking like a libertarian now. Okay, so I'll push back on that because I get to push back all the time too. What's the number? Right? What's
Yeah,
the upper income bracket? It's 35% here, and you get a few tax breaks, 10% in California. Ugh. But what's the right number?
yeah, this might shock you from a moral perspective. I actually never mind that I despise the incredibly criminal, punitive kind of progressive taxation. The more money you make, the higher your rate becomes. Okay, but I'm also against even a percentage tax that is so. In other words, if I make $500,000 and you tax me at 10%, and you make $50,000 and you're taxed at 10%, so we're both paying 10%, but I end up paying a lot more, right? By virtue of me making more money. In my view, what is ethically correct is you tax a singular, same flat tax to everybody. It's $10,000, it's $20,000, whatever it is, that's what you pay. Because otherwise, why wouldn't you extend the discrimination across people to how much you should pay for a car? It's not fair that we all pay the same $40,000 irrespective of our income brackets. If I make less money, I should pay one price, and if you make more money, you should pay another price. We don't allow that. That's called illegal. So why does the government get to say if you make a lot more money, it's going to cost you more for having all of the rights that everybody else pays a lot less for? So that's number one. Uh, Number two, in Canada, in 1917 is when we began levying income tax, and it was a temporary, short-term thing. So we went from having a country that could operate without levying a single cent of income tax to 105 years later, taking nearly 60% of my income. How did we get there? Now, by the way, it's not 60% in Quebec and Canada, because that's how much you take from my income. The rest of the money that you allow me to keep, if I spend that money, you tax me 15% of that. So you've already stolen 60% of my income. I'm left with 40%. Now you leave me alone? No, you'll take 15% of whatever I make on that. Okay, are you now leaving me alone? Did I pay enough now that I'm almost financially destitute? No, no, no. You now pay carbon tax. Now you pay gas tax. Now you pay property tax. Now you pay school tax. So at the end of the day, at the end of the year, when I file my taxes, if I've made $100, I'm roughly left with about 30 cents. Is that moral? Is that ethical? It seems that it isn't. So what is the number? I don't know what it is, but it's not
Yeah.
what we have in Canada.
Well, the argument by the counter to that is that, if I make 50,000 a year, the $10,000 hurts me a lot more than you who makes $500,000 a year. Therefore, that's the argument for the progressive
Sure.
nature of it. Just in terms of what you can afford, right? Anyway, but we're kind of on a sidebar there. I guess what I was looking for is, there's this idea of national happiness, like GDP, but it's a
Yeah, yeah.
national happiness score. I forget what that is. And so I think the idea there with these Northern European countries is they're a little more secure, so people worry less about, say, healthcare or whatever the finances are, being laid off work, or paternity leave and maternity leave and so on, and therefore it's less stressful. I think that's the idea. Therefore, their happiness maybe goes
So
up.
you're right. That's why I said the
Self-reported.
social safety net is there. There is trust in the institutions, which the corollary is that there is less endemic corruption. Imagine if every single interaction in your day-to-day life was rooted in the complete vagaries of the corruption of that day, right? I can't get you to if you stop me because I was speeding, whether I get a ticket or not depends on whether I give you bakshish as the police officer, right? So my ability to navigate and have sort of a predictable trajectory through my day is obviously going to be a lot easier to manage if there's order, if there's structure, if there's trust, if there is lack of corruption. And so it's not surprising that those countries that are on my list would make it to the top. But to me, that's not enough. I think for at least for me, so I'm not speaking based on national happiness scores. For me, the thing that would instantiate the greatest amount of sort of national happiness for me would be if I live somewhere sunny, hence the desire to be in Southern California, and if I come as close to possible to a libertarian ethos. I'm someone who's driven by every possible manifestation of freedom, and to live in a socialist utopia as I live is just unbearable. I'll give you a very quick example. Uh, we have in my neighborhood young police officers who sit and lie and wait. You know, they're 22-year-old newly minted cadets to try to stop you and give you a jaywalking ticket if you cross the street when the green light didn't say that it's okay. So I'm 58 years old. I have a lot of life experience. I went through the Lebanese civil war, but a 21-year-old agent of the government will decide if I have the mental acuity to look in a residential neighborhood to see on a one-way street if there is no car coming, do I have the autonomy, the cognitive autonomy to cross the street? If she's there hiding and I cross when the light says no, I get a ticket. That's not the kind of society that allows me to flourish. And that's why I want to get the hell out of this hell.
Well, I feel your pain, Gab, but I'm not sure California is the place to go for you then.
That's why I'm looking at
maybe
Florida. That's why I'm
maybe
looking at Florida.
Nevada, Florida, Texas. Everybody seems to be going to Texas. All right, let's talk about money and happiness. Tell us about the Easterlin paradox and what the latest research is. There was that original finding that making more than what, $75,000 a year.
Exactly.
That was a decade ago. Above that doesn't make you any happier, and I always thought that was a bullshit finding because these people just don't know how to spend their money.
Yes, so you're exactly right that the classic inflection point was at the 75,000 mark. The idea being that once all of my basic needs were met, to our earlier point, I don't have to worry about any day-to-day calamity. I can put food for my children. I'm not going to go to bed hungry. Beyond that, it doesn't really add much. Okay, we can debate. There's now some research that shows no, that number should be much higher. But generally speaking, it is absolutely incontrovertibly true that money does not result in greater happiness. So I don't think, for example, that Elon Musk is inherently happier than most of us because he probably has more money than all of us combined. If I have a very good marriage, if I have lovely children, if I have a great social network of meaningful, loyal friends, if I have a job that I wake up to and I get filled with purpose and meaning, I might very well be a lot happier than Elon Musk if he doesn't have many of those things that I have. So, and I give several examples of that to prove that point in the book. So, I tell the story. Let's call it for now the Herb Simon story. Herbert Simon was a very famous Nobel Prize winner who was very important in my own intellectual development because I studied psychology of decision making in my doctorate, in my dissertation. And Herb Simon was the guy who developed the idea of bounded rationality. He studied decision making. And so when I was doing my PhD at Cornell, my doctoral supervisor had advised me that Herb Simon was coming to visit Cornell, and he knew him well. He knew Herb Simon. And so I was very, very excited that I would get a chance to meet Herb Simon and so on. And so I had a family member who is very much immersed in pecuniary pursuits, which is the fancy term for going after money, who owned many fancy cars and so on. And so that particular individual and I were going to the Rio Carnival to hang out together on vacation. And I had, while we were at the airport, I had said to him, "Oh, I'm so excited to be meeting Herb Simon, blah, blah, blah." And so he looked at me very arrogantly and flippantly and said, "Who the hell is this guy? I could probably buy him 500 times over." And then I looked at him and I said, "You might be able to buy him 500 times over, but there are 500 people who are willing to listen to every word he says, whereas nobody gives a damn about anything you ever have to say." And then he get kind of gotten offended by me given that retort. But that really captures a mindset, right? The accumulation of material goods versus meaningful experience. And actually, there's a lot of research, including by my former professor at Cornell, Tom Gilovich, that looks at, are people happier when they accumulate material possessions or accumulate enriching experiences? And the research there couldn't be any clearer. The path to happiness is much more in spending for rich experiences. So money does not buy happiness, I'm afraid to tell all those who have Ferraris.
That reminds me of that Woody Allen line about his first wife, which appeared to be a lot of different people. They were trying to decide if they should take the European vacation or get the divorce. And while the European vacation would have been nice, the divorce is something you always have. Anyways. So, yeah, my thoughts on that. I think happiness is not the right metric in that case. Money doesn't buy you happiness. That's true. But it certainly buys you opportunities to do other things. So Elon can start his own spaceship company and rocket company and electric car company and a tunneling company and a mind, whatever that thing is, mind interface company, and so on. And that's what brings him happiness or self-satisfaction or fulfillment, is starting companies and doing big, grand projects like that. We're going to colonize Mars. Whoa, okay. I think it may actually happen. And you can't do that without money. You got to have money. It just opens doors and
so that
makes stuff happen.
That speaks to an earlier conversation thread that we had when I was talking about what makes you happy in your job. And I said a key feature is temporal freedom, if you remember. Well, what you just said is exactly that as well, right? Money grants me the freedom to pursue the things that I might want to pursue. Now, let me personalize it to my life. I actually use the language of escape velocity. So let me explain what I mean there. How much money does my next book need to make so that I can have the escape velocity to make the choices that I want to make? I want to move to Santa Barbara to hang out with Michael Shermer. I can. I want to move to Florida. I can. I want to stay in Montreal. I can. So for me, money is only important, and how much money I make off my next book is not because I get to buy a bigger house or I get to buy a boat that I've always wanted or a nicer car. It is exactly what you said, which is it buys me the necessary freedom through the escape velocity that I need to achieve. Otherwise, I couldn't give a damn about money.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of that. Yes, and a line I heard was, one problem being poor amongst others is you always have to think about money, but if you have enough, then you just don't have to think about it. And I've kind of tried to build that in my life. And at some point, I didn't have to think about it anymore. In other words, how much do I have to work this month to make the bills at the end of the month? Well, I don't really have to think about that now. Or like my wife says, well, can we stay an extra night at the little hotel we're at up in Pismo? It's like, I don't know. Sure, if you want to. I mean, I don't have to do any calculations like, oh, let's see if we can afford this extra night in the hotel. That's that temporal freedom. I just don't want to think about money. It's not that I want money. I just don't want to think about it. Now, much of that may depend on what your hobbies are. In my case, I buy a new bicycle every 4 or 5 years, and that's it. I'm happy just scooting around on public roads on my bike. But if I had a boat, or a private
Yes.
jet. I would love to fly private instead of having to use commercial. But if I tried to fly private, and it's like, $4 or $5 million for a plane, and then you got a full time pilot, $100,000 a year. You got to have. I would just be totally stressed out and worried about money constantly. So can't do that, right? So I guess I guess the principle would be what, adjust your goals to fit where you
Right.
are, so that you are happy where you're at.
Absolutely. And incidentally, as you know, Michael, if you do an analysis, and I think maybe Sports Illustrated had written an article, I can't remember which outlet had done so. You look at the number of, I can't remember if it was NFL players or NFL and NBA players, some group of, very wealthy athletes, the number of which end up filing for bankruptcy and being completely financially destitute
Mm.
is simply astounding, right? How does Mike Tyson, who made $300 million on a fight, how does he file for bankruptcy? Like, what is the mechanism by which you must spend so much of $300 million that you are bankrupt? And so, to me, if I were super wealthy, this probably won't surprise you. The kind of ostentatious purchases that I would engage in is I would build the most outlandish, antiquarian book collection possible, right? So I would be going to that Palm Beach antiquarian store where I saw in my own eye, with my own eyes, a first edition copy, $400,000 of on the origin of species. Well, I would want now. That's not signaling. I'm not going to be driving down the Santa Barbara highway showing that book, but that would bring me great pleasure that I'm somehow connected to that first edition of this great book. So that would be the type of ostentatious purchases that I would engage in. But fancy cars, fancy boats mean nothing to me.
I had a first edition of The Origin of Species, that a first print run of the first edition, that was given to me in 1996, donated to the Skeptic Society, I should say, by a retired biology professor. He just contacted me out of the blue, big fan of supporter of the Skeptics, and he said, I have a whole set of first editions of all of Darwin's books. Would you like them? I'm like, holy crap, yes, of course. But you should get them evaluated, and so you can deduct it off your taxes. We're a 501c3 anyway, so we did, and he deducted that off his taxes. I think the origin at the time was like 60,000 or something. Anyway, not only did I not show this off, I had it like hidden away in a safe, a fireproof safe. Like, I was just scared shitless that the dog was going to eat it, or the place would burn
Oh
down,
my
or oh my God.
God.
And so when 2009 came around, the bicentennial of Darwin's birth and the 150th anniversary of The Origin of Species, I sold it because I thought this is a good opportunity, and I'm too nervous having this thing sitting around. So I did. I sold it for, I think it was 125,000 in 2009. And this is all me, not me personally, but Skeptic Society money. And I plowed it into the stock market: Apple, Google, Intel, Microsoft, Netflix. Maybe it wasn't Netflix, but all Amazon. All these and it's gone way up. So the Skeptic Society, because of that one book. And by the
Oh
way,
my
it was a
God.
massive drop off from that. Yeah, I never told you that story. Oh yeah,
I've never.
I think the
That's a
Descent of
mind.
Man.
You touched that.
Totally mind
How
blowing.
did you not show me this?
Yes.
I,
This is
I
before I met you.
that's what I was thinking. It had to be before we met. You said 2009.
Yeah, that's when I sold
Oh
it.
my
Yeah.
God. I know this is
And
going to
now
be
you
like,
say it's worth, it's 400,000 now, you
so
think?
the copy that was in that store. As a matter of fact, I did a sad truth clip where I had videotaped. I mean, I had taped my going around the store and taping that particular. It's 400,000. It was the most expensive
Oh.
book in that store. Now, here's the interesting thing. This might interest you. I was very surprised. So, contrary to how you were feeling that you don't want the dog to eat it or you don't want someone to steal it, I didn't see any Belgian shepherds guarding it. I didn't see any men with machine guns. So I told the guy, I said, how is this just openly available? Like, aren't you afraid? He goes, so his answer to me didn't really satisfy me. He goes, well, I mean, if someone stole it, it's not as if they could do anything with it because, they couldn't
Mm,
sell it. But what if you are a private collector and you
yes, yeah.
hire someone to steal it so that it could stay in your basement, humidor? That doesn't
Yeah.
seem like a reasonable answer. What are your thoughts on that?
No. Yeah, no, absolutely. Because that is what happens when art gets stolen, and they wait for it to come on the market so they can find out who stole it, but it doesn't go out in the public market. It's
Exactly.
just there's like a black market of people that collect this stuff under the radar. Yeah. All right, let's talk about the inverted U. That's one of my favorite parts of your book.
Oh,
How do
yes.
you apply that? Explain it, and how do you apply that to happiness?
Right. So, when I was a mathematics student, I used to always be fascinated by, curves. What is the function that can generate that particular curve form? And so I actually discussed this at the start of that chapter. And so then, as I was trying to think about what is the most fundamental curve that is that defines all sorts of phenomena, certainly human phenomena, I came to the conclusion that the inverted U is that universal curve. So the inverted U simply means too little of something is not good, too much of something is not good, and it's inverted U. So the middle point, the sweet spot, is the optimal point. Well, Aristotle had already said this in the Nicomachean Ethics, where he talked about the golden mean, right? He said, if you have a soldier who is too cowardly, that's bad. If the soldier is too reckless in his courage, that's bad. He's going to die. The sweet spot, I mean, he didn't use the term sweet spot, but the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. Buddha talked about middle way. So there are many, many different traditions of philosophers and schools of thought across many different cultures that have come to that conclusion, including Maimonides, the Jewish philosopher. And so what I did in this chapter is I said, okay, well, I'm now going to go through as many possible diverse examples at the neuronal level, at the individual level, at the societal level to show that the optimal functioning for whatever the phenomenon at play is exactly adhering to the inverted U curve. And so life then becomes finding the sweet spot in order to achieve maximal flourishing. Now, that's easier said than done, right? Because the sweet spot can vary depending on the context, or depending on the people, but at least know that the pursuit of the sweet spot is the only path to happiness. And so, if you want, I can give you an example of.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So, for example, perfectionism, right?
Hmm.
Perfectionism follows the inverted U. If I'm not in the least bit perfectionist as an author, I'm not going to be attention, detail oriented, and my work quality will suffer. If, on the other hand, I am too perfectionist, as yours truly is, when I receive the galley proofs, it's actually not a reason to celebrate, but it's a reason to go into existential angst because I'm going to read the galley proofs 9,700 times to make sure that there wasn't a single comma that is out of place. Well, that's too much, right? I could have used all those hours to pursue other meaningful things rather than worrying about some reader down the line finding a typo in my work. But I can't help it. I can't extricate myself. The optimal level of perfectionism is somewhere between those 2 points. How about jealousy in a romantic relationship? If I never exhibit any jealousy, then that sends a cue that I probably don't care about my partner. That's why oftentimes we have the stereotypical case where if a woman thinks that her man is not sufficiently vested in their relationship, she'll try to trigger jealousy in him, if only to get that validation that he cares. On the other hand, if I am too jealous so that I become a abusive territorial jerk, that's probably not good. There's some medium level of jealousy where we can all be happy with. And so I demonstrate for an endless number, litany of cases that inverted U shape keeps coming up. And so I'm delighted to hear that that was one of your favorite parts because it was a really challenging part to write because I had to sit there and think, what other examples can I go into the literature to find evidence for the inverted U?
Nice. All right. Let's say I'm too far on one of the ends or the other. I'm too much of a perfectionist. What kind of cognitive behavior therapy can I apply to myself to get me in the middle of the U,
So in that case, and
whatever it is?
by the way, I'm going to give the prescription answer to you. That doesn't mean that I could implement it on myself, right? I would be a hypocrite if I told
Okay.
you that I could.
Right.
It's kind of like physicians heal thyself or so on. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so,
Mm-hmm.
so I would say stop for a second and say this. Is it the 100 extra hours that I'm going to be spending making sure that that comma is not out of place. Imagine if I use those 100 hours to start working on the book prospectus for my next book. Objectively speaking, what is pragmatically speaking the better decision? So at least be mindful of that calculus. The problem, though, and I don't want to be a hypocrite, the problem is I'm well aware of that thought process, and yet I can't extricate myself on being on the wrong end of the perfectionist. So it's a struggle. But at least having that knowledge, having that ability to know thyself, right? I've got in the book, I've got the Delphic maxim, know thyself, that the Greeks had taught us. At least being aware of that is the first step to being able to autocorrect to the right part of the sweet spot.
To thine own self be true. Yes, indeed. That's the hard part, though, figuring that out. And your answer to that would be try lots of different things and see what you're good at, and just don't do the others that you're not good at.
That sounds like a good synopsis of things. Indeed.
Yeah. All right. I just have to ask you about Benford's law. This is the most peculiar thing. It almost sounds mystical or woo-woo.
Isn't that incredible?
Explain this.
So I discovered this. So this is also in the chapter on the inverted U at the start, where. So let's do this. Let's give a concrete example. This comes from a Netflix series that I was watching. That's where that example comes from. Let's suppose you take all of your Facebook friends. Let's say you've got 500 Facebook friends, and so person one, friend one, has 132 friends. Person two has 232 friends. So take the first digit of their friends total, and then provide the distribution. How many times is there a 1? How many times is there a 2? How many times is there a 3? And so on. It turns out to follow, hence that law, a particular distribution that is so outlandishly counterintuitive. It just makes no sense. It's magical. It's mystical. And yet that pattern is so recurring that it is used in detecting, for example, tax fraud, right? So that distribution recurs in so many disparate contexts that you can, place bets on if it doesn't adhere to this, something fishy is going on. That's what that law is, basically. Isn't that amazing?
So interesting. Yeah, it is amazing. And even more amazing is I had a Christopher Chabris on the show yesterday. I recorded his book, co-authored with Dan Simon's Nobody's Fool, about cons and being fooled and so on in all domains of life. And they have a discussion of Benford's law because that's one of the ways used. Yeah. So I encountered it twice in the same week in two different new books. I guess it's used to detect not just tax fraud, but also scientific people that make up data, scientists that are fraud, that's one of the ways to detect it.
Yeah. I as I was writing that section, so I first came across Benford and I said, that makes no sense. That's insane. So then I went to the literature. I definitely found that it exists. I found where you apply it to detect fraud. But what I still don't know, as a previous mathematics guy, so what is the analytical explanation for that particular counterintuitive distribution? I don't have a good answer for that.
I don't either. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a true paranormal mystery. Okay, yeah, let's bring this into the finish line here. Okay, now we're going to shift to the lightning round. I'm just going to ask you some fun, short questions.
Sure.
What is something that you used to believe in strongly, but you have since changed your mind about?
In any possible domain?
Anything. Yeah, anything. Yeah.
I used to be very grateful for having been accepted to Quebec and Canada, and I still remain so. But now I despise Quebec and Canada.
Okay, that's good. I like that. Let's see. You actually have a discussion of this in your book. If you had a conversation with any historical figure, living or dead, who would it be and what would you ask them? I actually have the list here in your book.
Yeah.
You list, let's see, Albert Einstein, Charles Darwin, Isaac Newton, Galileo Galilei, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Leonardo da Vinci, Maimonides, and King Solomon. How come those figures?
Yeah. Oh, wow. What a great question. So I do describe in a Psychology Today article that I had written many previous years why each of those would be there. But to answer your original question, which would I pick out of those 10? It would probably have to be Leonardo da Vinci because of his polymath qualities, right? I mean, he literally is the Renaissance man, right? And I love people who are able to be broad, not only thinkers, you know, in many different domains, right? And so that comes up, what you just quoted, the 10 guys that you quoted, and that I would like to have dinner. That comes in a section in the book where I'm talking about intellectual variety seeking, to our earlier point. And I argue that life is too short to be a stay in your lane person, right? Whether it be in my academic research, I don't just do work in one area. I don't only publish in one type of journal. I don't only publish in peer reviewed journals because life is too short. I need to constantly be exploring new intellectual landscapes. And therefore, I admire people who are interdisciplinary, who are able to create consilience, as per E.O. Wilson, tie different disparate things that you wouldn't otherwise think should be tied. And so, out of those 10, if I have to pick one, it has to be the great Leonardo da Vinci. He's a sculptor, he's a painter, he's a engineer, he's a
Scientist.
futurist, he's a scientist. I mean, what the hell, man? I mean, that, I'm good at soccer and academia, and that's it. He's good at everything. So I'd like to
I
chat with
wonder
him.
if could anyone be a Da Vinci today? Is there just there wasn't as much known then, and the world was more open and unknown for a mind like that to explore, and now
So
there's just too much specialization.
So maybe at the level of intellectual pursuits, what you said may be true, but he transcended that. So he created consilience across the arts and
Mm.
science, as per E.O. Wilson, right? I mean,
Mm.
it is him who painted uh, Mona Lisa, right? So he wasn't just a great scholar, right? For example, I draw at the level of a 5-year-old, right? I mean, genuinely, I have the artistic ability. I'm stuck developmentally in my artistic abilities at the stick figures. Well, but of course, I have a developed intellectual sense. But he has both. He paints the way he does, and he could probably converse with me, if he were alive today, on things that are very cerebral. So I think that might be possible. But you're right that academia really pushes the hyper specialization.
Okay, a couple of these other questions. These were I went out to my Twitter followers who gave questions of just
Sure.
personal questions of guests. Most of these you actually answer in the book. So I'll go to let's see, what's the most important lesson you've learned in your life so far? But that is kind of in your book, right? Having a loving marriage, having challenges, so on. Is there that probably would be the answer, right?
That would be the answer. So that would be as defined in my relationship to others. That would be so because,
Mm,
right, in terms of internally, for me, the most important lesson, which is something that I discuss when I talk about know thyself, when I talk about existential authenticity, it is to be authentic. And perhaps I am in the inverted U, authentic to a fault, right? Whereby I don't
mm,
modulate what I need to say, even though pragmatically I might have been better off holding my tongue, right? I just can't do it because then I would feel inauthentic. But to me, that's not a flaw. To me, it actually
mm,
allows me to present myself to the world as though I am 18 feet tall because there are no
mm,
fissures in my personhood. So I don't have to think of any lies that I might have said or because I always present myself to the world in full authenticity. So I don't know if it's a lesson that I learned, but it's something that has always brought me a lot of self assuredness because I present myself as a honey badger. Here I am. I hope you like me. And if you don't, F off.
the honey badger. There was a video going around yesterday on Twitter. I don't know if you saw it of the honey badger that's wrapped up in a python,
I've
and the
previously seen it.
tourist camera. Oh, maybe it's old. I don't know. Maybe it's the first time I've seen it. But the tourist starts and the honey badger is completely enveloped in this python and it's pushing it off and it's pushing it off. That takes 2 or 3 minutes and it finally escapes. You think it's going to run off, but no, it turns around and goes after the python, which is hilarious.
So
and then
the two jackals or two,
yeah, go ahead.
right?
The jackals, yes, yeah.
I mean, it's
right,
insane,
and they
right?
want to get in on it, and he's like, you're not going to get this python. This is mine.
Exactly.
It's hilarious.
He's authentic to who he is, right? And so to me, I think it's very, very hard to walk in life with self-assuredness and self-confidence if you're not authentic, because by definition then there's something that you're modulating. Like, not to get political, Hillary Clinton can't be authentic when she's constantly changing the accent that she speaks in, right? Because that's a manifestation of inauthenticity. Suddenly you become a Southern Baptist preacher because you're speaking to an audience of Black people. That seems false to me. It rings of falsity. Whereas, I just walk through the world completely self-assured because I'm comfortable in my skin. And therefore, yes, I'd love for you to like me. But if you don't, at least I can sleep well at night knowing that I didn't modulate who I was to please you.
All right, I'm going to end this by reading the final passage of your book. Savior, the infinitesimally small probability of your having ever existed. Of course, life has countless difficult moments that we must overcome. But we have at our disposal several tried and tested antidotes to existential darkness. I have offered you a template or blueprint for maximizing your chances at happiness. To summarize, my recipe for the good life includes 1, finding the right spouse, 2, working in the right profession, 3, seeking the sweet spot, the inverted U, across many of life's domains, 4, engaging life via a playful mindset, 5, pursuing variety seeking at times across many domains, but not all, 6, ensuring that one is persistent in the pursuit of meaningful goals, 7, being anti-fragile, channel your inner honey badger
There you go.
when dealing with failure, and 8, seeking to minimize future regret, in part by living an authentic life, which is what you just said. Gad Saad, thank you so much for your book. Here it is again, Happiness, The Sad Truth About Happiness, 8 Secrets for Living the Good Life. All right, nice to see you again, Gad.
Thank you so much. It was such fun talking to you, Michael. Thank you.